You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Helpful new book just out called Onward, Engaging the Culture Without Losing the Gospel. Dr. Russell Moore is with us. And Dr. Moore, certainly I'd like to have you maybe address what pastors can do, because you have a chapter on culture, and maybe I think pastors need to make sure that we are encouraging us to have an eternal perspective, not to be culturally captive. In terms of mission, understand what cultural engagement means, and then chapters on human dignity and religious liberty and family stability. These are issues that need to be addressed from the pulpit and even in our Bible fellowships and our various churches, don't they?
They do, and I think the primary way to do that is to start with a vision of what our lives actually are. And I find that too many Christians, we sort of implicitly assume that our lives are the next 30, 40, 50, 60, 100 years. And part of the job of teaching within the church, whether that's from the pulpit or in a Bible study or a Sunday school class, is giving us a vision of the next trillion years. A vision of the fact that we are people who are joint heirs with Christ. We're going to rule and reign with Him, which means that the things that matter to Him ought to matter to us, and the sort of people who matter to Him ought to matter to us. And so that means creating a culture within our churches that stands apart from the survival of the fittest Darwinian sort of world that we see on the outside.
Sure.
Where we really, it's not just that we welcome the sort of people that the world doesn't recognize, but those sorts of people are also leading us. And I think that takes a genuine spirit, conviction, and turnaround in order to get there.
Let's talk about some of the resources that might be available to individuals. Of course, you and I are Southern Baptists, but even if you're not, the Ethics and Religious Liberty Commission have some great resources, and it does seem to me that if a pastor is saying, okay, I do need to address that issue, maybe once a year, Sanctity of Life Sunday would be a good time to talk about abortion, and certainly we need to talk about racial reconciliation, and certainly I could get into some other issues, but it sure would be helpful if there was an organization that had resources in that regard. Talk about what would be available to those individuals that are in positions of leadership.
Well, we have resources ranging from everything from sample sermons on various topics, articles, fact sheets, even bulletin inserts that you can adapt and use as you want to in your own churches, on everything from end of life questions and helping women in crisis questions, to orphan care, to reproductive technology questions, to ministering to immigrants and racial reconciliation, and the full spectrum of really what does it mean for us to follow Christ in today's culture.
I'd be remiss if I didn't talk a little bit about Planned Parenthood. Anybody that receives any of your Twitter account of tweets and things like that will see that you've been writing about this. And, of course, there's a vote today in the United States Senate, which may not go anywhere, but it's just one more opportunity to put people on the record on this issue. Right. But talk about how you would apply this book and some of the principles you have here about human dignity, as well as how we relate to the culture, to this particular issue of these videos that have come out about Planned Parenthood.
Well, the kingdom of God comes to those who are children, the Scripture tells us. And one of the things that I talk about in this book is recognizing human dignity within the church as we start to, for instance, with that Down syndrome child in our church, we don't see him as a charity project. We see him as our brother in Christ and as a future king of the universe, and we treat him as such. And as we do so, our consciences ought to be shaped and formed where we don't see people in terms of their usefulness. And that's really what's at the heart of this Planned Parenthood debate, is there's this violent assumption that those who have the power ought to be able to lord that power over those who are weak and vulnerable. And so these children have words used to dehumanize them, product of conception, and so forth, in public. And then in private, as we see on these videos, there's talk of not just clumps of cells, but hearts and livers and hands, and it's another boy, that sort of language that is being used. And so the conscience ought to be shocked by this, but our response shouldn't be simply to turn away in revulsion. Our response ought to say, how do we work for justice here for these unborn children and for women in crisis? And then how do we also speak with a gospel message to those whose consciences are really raw as they're seeing this debate and they're seeing these videos because they've experienced abortion and they've been part of that. So how do we speak to them with a gospel word that speaks of reconciliation to God through Jesus Christ?
I was thinking one other option, and that is the adoption option, if you will, because
Right.
I know that you've written Adopted for Life, the priority of adoption for Christian families and churches. This has become one of your causes, and it seems to me that we should really emphasize that as well, that if a woman who is convinced that the only answer to her so-called crisis pregnancy is abortion, we say, no, save the baby. There are couples that should and would want to adopt that child, and so adoption is another part of this idea of family, isn't it?
That's exactly right. And there are pregnancy resource centers all over this country that are willing to empower women to think through how to go forward after a pregnancy. For some women, that will be making an adoption plan for their child. For other women, that will be getting the support that they need in order to care for the child at home. But they can be empowered to do that in nonviolent ways. And what's happening is that Planned Parenthood and clinics like Planned Parenthood are saying to women, you have a problem and we can fix it. And the way that they offer to fix it is with violence. And there's a better way. And we need even more churches and Christians to be actively involved in ministry there.
Very good. Just before I let you go, your final chapter about this idea of a gospel counter-revolution. Let's talk about what this looks like, because we are living in a different world, and you really are giving us a sense that we're going to have to maybe rethink the way in which we do ministry, the way in which we do church, the way in which the church is presented to the watching world.
Well, one of the things I think we need to do is to recognize that Christianity isn't genetic. And so many of the people who are opposed to us right now, and many of those who may even hate us right now, may well be our future brothers and sisters in Christ. And it may be that, say, that operator of a Planned Parenthood clinic right now may turn out to be the one who will lead your children or grandchildren or great-grandchildren to faith in Christ. Because Saul of Tarsus was never in Vacation Bible School. He was a serial-killing terrorist, and no one expected him to even be part of the church, much less the great missionary leader of the first century. And so we have a gospel that carries with it its own power, and many of the people who are at odds with us right now, well, they may not always be.
Yeah, and they are not enemies. They are future converts, is the way I like to say it every once in a while.
Exactly.
And I love your line there, the future Billy Graham could be a drunk right now. And
That's
anybody
right.
that denies that, just think of Chuck Colson, those of us that were involved politically, since I'm about 20 years your senior. I remember Chuck Colson, and it would have been hard for anybody in the late 1960s, early 1970s to have thought that individual would eventually be leading a ministry and having the kind of impact that he had. So again, just a great reminder of that. One more time, let's talk about some of the resources that are available at the Ethics and Religious Liberty Commission. We have an opportunity for people, if they can't find the book in their bookstore, but I'm sure it will show up in almost all the Christian bookstores, that they can order it. But if they want to connect up with you or to follow your blog, your Facebook page, or your Twitter account, we have all of those on the website. But again, remind us of any resources that might be helpful if they want to take this book and use it maybe in teaching a Sunday school class.
Well, we have a curriculum that goes along with it, published by Lifeway, that could be used to teach through it, and also a video series that people can use, so they can use the videos to teach through the issues in the book.
Well, again, you can go to the various websites. We also have a website to more to the point, which is russellmoore.com, so you can find out a little bit more as well. Dr. Russell Moore, appreciate the good work that you do there at the Ethics and Religious Liberty Commission. Thank you for joining us today here on Point of View.
Thanks so much for having me.
We're going to take a break, and when we come back, we'll get into a few more of these issues. But as you heard us say just a minute ago, we are going to encourage you, if you have not already done so, to contact your two members of the United States Senate about the issue of Planned Parenthood. We did send out an email today. Warren Kelly sent it out, and if you have not done so, we wanted to encourage you to take action, and you can do so by clicking on that button. It has an opportunity there for you to contact your two senators about this vote, And even if they voted, even if you know your senators don't care, I think it's important for you to let them know, and it's also important for them to be on record in terms of their stand. I am saddened to say that it doesn't look like there are going to be too many on the Democratic side of the aisle that will vote to defund Planned Parenthood, but we will see. And if nothing else, a roll call vote will tell us a lot. And we do have an election coming up, and that's something to pay attention to as well. All that information available at our website, pointofview.net. And as we come back from a break, if you'd like to join our conversation, perhaps you have comments about how we should interact with the culture, your comments about these Planned Parenthood videos, I'll give you an open line, 1-800-351-1212. We'll talk more about some other issues right after this.
If you've been a Christian for any length of time, no doubt you've heard about Jesus feeding thousands with a few loaves of bread and a couple of fish. Jesus took something small and turned it into something big. Recently, someone here at Point of View made an interesting discovery. He did some math and figured out that according to the number of faithful listeners we have, if you and every other listener gave $5, it would help Kerby and the team bring you interviews and commentary for not 3 months, but 3 years. You heard me right. If every listener donates just $5, we'd pay what it costs to bring you this needed information for 3 years. And if you urge a friend to join you, you send 5, they send 5, well, you can imagine the impact. Click the Donate Now button at pointofview.net, pointofview.net, or send $5 to Point of View, Box 30, Dallas, Texas 75221, Box 30, Dallas 75221. Send $5. Urge a friend to join you. Support Point of View. Point of View will continue after this.
listening to Point of View. The opinions expressed on Point of View do not necessarily reflect the views of the management or staff of this station. And now, here again is Kerby Anderson.
If you'd like to join our conversation, 1-800-351-1212. We'll open up the phones. A little bit later, we're going to be talking with Katie Yoder, and she is with the Center for Media Research and actually has been keeping track of how many minutes have been given to the coverage of Cecil the Lion compared to the amount of coverage by the mainstream media of Planned Parenthood. And of course, I think you've already heard some of that, so we'll talk about that a little bit later. But if you'd like to join the conversation, 1-800-351-1212. David in Texas, KBJS, thank you for calling. You have the floor.
Well, I was just curious. In your previous interview, if I understood him correctly, your subject there mentioned that Planned Parenthood uses the term product of conception,
Yes,
and everything. So doesn't that then, for them, concede that conception begins with the meeting of the sperm and the egg, therefore life begins at conception?
right. Yeah, again, it is amazing how if you are for abortion, you call yourself pro-choice, or a lot of people are just really pro-abortion. I mean, people that work in abortion clinics certainly are pro-abortion. They are basically having to come up with some kind of semantic trick to try as best as possible with semantics, try to minimize the impact of what they are doing. Because if indeed you really follow it to its logical conclusion, David, as you did, then if conception brings about life, then that means you're killing life. So even when they try to find ways to dehumanize the unborn baby by calling it a fetus or a product of conception, it still doesn't work very well if you use even a little bit of your brain power, because you can recognize that you're obviously dealing with a human being in the womb who was created at conception. So I think your point's well taken. It's a good point.
Sir.
If you'd like to join our conversation, that opens up a line, 1-800-351-1212. And I think that's important to recognize that there has been almost a shift in some of the discussion legally, because the argument is, well, okay, this is a human being. It's a Homo sapiens, 46 chromosomes. That's what we call a human being. Put in a non-hostile environment, it's called a baby. So they have now sometimes legally said, well, yeah, it may be a human, but it's not a person. And since the 14th Amendment only protects persons, of course, we went into this when we didn't call African-American slaves persons. Okay, so we're back to the same kind of argument. Since it's not a person, then it does not have to have legal protection. And so, again, you see some of these semantic changes that are taking place. And he was referring to the interview I did just a minute ago with Dr. Russell Moore. He only was able to give us half an hour on his new book, Onward, Engaging the Culture Without Losing the Gospel. So, again, I commend the book to you. And speaking of Moore, I was with Johnny Moore. You remember him on the program talking about what has been happening with ISIS. Define ISIS is his book. And since he was on, we have asked you to give to the Cradle Fund. And I was just sharing with him briefly when I saw him at a church that we went from $35,000 check that we sent to the Cradle Fund. Now we've sent even more. It's over $50,000. So anyway, it's just pretty encouraging to him. And he just said, thank you 1,000 times for having me on the program and for doing what you're doing. And so again, I want to thank those of you that gave to the Cradle Fund. And if you're new to the program or can't remember what that is, it's a fund that in part was started by Johnny Moore and another individual who actually heads it up, who himself has a lot of connections through the United Nations and other Southern Baptists, but nevertheless, they provide the money to the various church leaders, the pastors and others in these refugee camps, because you're really, in a sense, buying a bed for some of these people, a pillow for some of them, some blankets, clothes, whatever it might be, as well as food. And so we have made a decision that anything that you designate to the Cradle Fund, 100% of that goes on to them. And it's just one very small way, but certainly a significant way that we can make the difference in the lives of our brothers and sisters overseas, and that have been so harmed by ISIS and are fleeing in some cases for their lives away from their homes. And I had a fresh appreciation for some of that, but I'm off target. So let's go back to some phone calls here. If you'd like to talk about Planned Parenthood, the issue of abortion, I'm going to give you some facts and figures here in just a minute, but let's head out to California for just a minute. KYCC, Gail, thank you for joining us today.
Thank you for taking my call. Hopefully you can enlighten me or explain this a little bit further, but at this point, because we have this disaster thing called Obamacare, why do we need Planned Parenthood when even the poor are now allowed to get abortions through Obamacare? What do we need Planned Parenthood for? And you have to be really, really poor if you can't afford contraception, such as, the pill or other things. So, why do we need Planned Parenthood anyway? And why can't they just be a nonprofit organization if they have to exist at all?
Oh, I think you've asked some very good questions, and you set up for the next piece I was going to cover. So let's sit back and talk about that for just a minute. Of course, the vote taking place today to defund Planned Parenthood. And you might remember even on Friday, I read one of the letters that came back to one of our listeners already after we encouraged them to contact them. And this was in particular a letter from Senator Bennett in Colorado. Oh, well, they do so much good. They do these kinds of things. Well, first of all, let's set aside the lie that they actually do breast cancer screenings, because they don't. But there is a very good piece that's come out the other day by Mallory Quigley, and I will give you the bottom line by first of all saying that if you really want to minister to and meet some of the health needs of the very poor, we have 13 times more federally qualified health centers than we have Planned Parenthood centers. So first of all, if you want to actually get any kind of true health care, screenings and other things, those are already provided by more than 9,000. We're going to eventually get up to maybe 10,000 different federally qualified health centers where you get a lot more than what you would get at a Planned Parenthood clinic. And they serve 21 million individuals already right now. So some have suggested that by defunding Planned Parenthood, they'd take that same amount of money and put those in the federally qualified health centers. And so if you look at the number of centers, there's 13 times as many. If you look at how many people are provided, again, you have a ratio that is close to that as well, almost 10 times as much, more than just almost 10 times as much. So you say, well, okay, what does Planned Parenthood provide that these qualified health centers do not provide? Oh, abortions. And that is, Planned Parenthood is the world leader in the number of abortions, 300,000 plus every single year. So back to Gail's question, which is a very good question, is why do we need Planned Parenthood at all? And the reality is Planned Parenthood over the years has tried to do some other things so that it doesn't look like it's nothing more than an abortion mill. And it does a few other things, but all of those things, if you will, all those medical procedures, even the distribution of contraceptives and all the rest, and providing contraception to individuals, you can provide it in other ways more efficiently without having to have our tax dollars go towards Planned Parenthood. Now, I'll issue the disclaimer we issue every single time, and that is, yes, the $528 million of your tax dollars that go to Planned Parenthood theoretically do not go to abortions. So the idea is no, you're not paying for abortions. But the reality is that money is fungible. If you don't know what the word fungible is, look it up in the dictionary or talk to an accountant. It's real simple. If I fund these areas over here in one part of the clinic that don't do abortions, that frees up money that I can then use to even help promote abortions in the other part of the clinic, if that makes sense. So the point is that there are some very significant things that are happening right now, and I think in large part there has been a very significant question as to whether or not we should actually send our tax dollars to Planned Parenthood. There's a second question that I've raised, and I'm glad to see some presidential candidates have raised it. I noticed that former Texas Governor Rick Perry has raised it, and some others may have as well, so I'm not saying he's the only one, but certainly he raised the other day of why is it even a 501c3 tax-exempt organization? The reason we have tax-exempt organizations is because they provide some benefit to the community. If you think aborting 300,000 babies every year is a benefit to the community, okay, I can't argue against that kind of perverse logic. But if you say, really, are they a blight on the community rather than a benefit to the community, then that would be a really good reason to ask why they should even be a tax-exempt organization. By the way, that's not the only one. I mean, there have been others that have said, why is the NFL tax exempt? And, all sorts of other groups. So it's a question that I think is going to start surfacing because, as we talked about in a previous Take Action, we've also encouraged you to support the First Amendment Defense Act, and this would be an attempt to prevent churches from losing their tax-exempt status. But at the same time, I think it's going to really spawn a debate as to whether or not certain organizations should be tax-exempt. I think I can make a very good case for the tremendous benefit churches provide to the community. I have real difficulty talking about any benefit that Planned Parenthood provides to the community. If you'd like to join us, 1-800-351-1212. We'll have more right after this.
Now, back to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
If you'd like to join our conversation, 1-800-351-1212. Let's head up to New Hampshire, WSEW. Rachel, thank you for joining us today here on Point of View.
Hey, I'm glad that we're talking about defunding Planned Parenthood, but I also want to talk about what we're going to do to help women facing crisis pregnancies, and we need to support pregnancy help centers. And they're in every state around the country, and there are different ways that we can do that. We can volunteer our time, we can donate our money, we can also organize fundraisers within our community and our churches. They're always looking for diapers and clothes, cribs and car seats, because when women know that they have emotional support and practical support, they're going to be more apt to keep their babies and if we're against abortion, we also need to be supporting these women making the choice to choose life.
Very good. You know, I've said so often here, if you're against something, you should be for something, and abortion is a good example. Being against abortion means you really need to find your local pregnancy health center or crisis pregnancy center, whatever they might be called in this day and age. And I've spoken at many of these pregnancy health center banquets, and I'm going to do a MC for one just next month. And I just think that you are on the front lines of the pro-life movement, and it's, again, a great opportunity for us to give a positive message. And the good news is we're winning the war of ideas, Rachel. As you may know, we actually have now more pregnancy centers in America than we have abortion clinics in America. And so that's an encouraging sign as well. So I appreciate you giving us an idea. And again, as you pointed out, giving you your time, your talent, and your treasure. You know, certainly there's time. I mean, right now, some women might say, well, I'm not sure I could ever counsel an abortion-minded woman. Well, you have training for that, or even to deal with women that maybe have been exploited by abortion and are struggling with that. Certainly the time is an important part, and certainly your talent. Some even can get the men involved in, you know, painting the clinics or providing resources, but also the financial resources. And I would like to have every pregnancy help center in the country have an ultrasound, because, as you probably know as well, when a woman sees her baby, all of a sudden that changes everything. And so, again, this is just a great movement. And talk one more time about how people can help, maybe you there in New Hampshire or anywhere else in their community.
Well, you can just do a simple Google search on pregnancy help centers in your state. In New Hampshire, we have CareNet as an example, and they're great. They do spiritual support. They do parenting lessons and counseling. It's not just a pro-birth movement. It's a whole life pro-life thing. So if you're really pro-life, you got to care about the baby inside the womb and outside the womb. You have to care about the mother when she's pregnant and after she's pregnant. And these organizations, they care. And we can't just be talking about being against abortion. We have to care, you know, during pregnancy and after pregnancy. So go online, search Google for your pregnancy center. If you're in New Hampshire, you can go to nhrtl.org, and there's a section on there to how to support your local pregnancy health center.
Oh, very good. Appreciate you joining us. And again, I would encourage people that especially are in leadership positions to know where that is, because if you're a pastor or a Sunday school leader, you find out that maybe if you're a pastor, somebody comes in and says, I'm pregnant, I'm trying to figure out what to do. You need to immediately know how to provide that connection. Perhaps if you're a Sunday school leader and find out that a teenage girl is pregnant and the parents are wondering what to do, you need to know where those connections are. So take the time to find out. And so, Rachel, I appreciate you reminding us once again of those of you that are on the front lines of the pro-life movement, and thank you for the good work that you're doing there through the pregnancy help centers.
Thanks, take care.
One of the questions I wanted to put on the table were actually 5 questions. I'm not sure I'll get through all of them. I'll give a brief summary. We might get into some of that in the second hour to, a little bit later, but this one came out through Newsmax. 5 questions about the fight over Planned Parenthood. The first question, how did this latest skirmish over Planned Parenthood get started? If you've been listening to Point of View, I will summarize this by simply saying that a lot of the statements that were made in the videos, which were created by the Center for Medical Progress, help us understand that Planned Parenthood officials, and these were all high-up officials that were being interviewed, actually were apparently profiting from selling fetal organs. You are allowed to reimburse the expenses, but when they're talking about what kind of price to charge, when they're talking about, well, maybe I can get a Lamborghini, which of course was a joke, but nevertheless illustrates that is the case. And those videos have been very important. And as we pointed out on Friday, a federal judge in San Francisco blocked the release. That individual, by the way, was very instrumental in raising funds for the campaign of Barack Obama. I think it's a good example of an individual that might have recused himself. But anyway, we'll leave that. Second question, what does Planned Parenthood do? And it says, well, there's roughly 1 million abortions every year, but Planned Parenthood performed 328,000 of those. Like I said, more than 300,000. They have about 700 clinics, but that pales in comparison, as I pointed out to just a minute ago, these federally qualified health centers. You have 13 times more individuals that are actually in centers that are going to provide real, true health care compared to Planned Parenthood. And in terms of the number of individuals served, almost 10 times as many as Planned Parenthood. So you can see that. And of course, one of the questions that is raised here by former governor of Alaska and former presidential candidate Sarah Palin, why is it that 80% of Planned Parenthood shops are set up in minority neighborhoods? Certainly a very important issue. Third question, what's the fight in the Senate? Well, it has to do with whether or not they will receive the $528 million that comes from your pockets, from the taxpayers, and that, of course, has been a battle taking place right now. We'll talk about what that means in the second hour. Where are the battle lines drawn? Well, you have Joni Ernst, who is the sponsor of the Senate bill being considered right now. And, of course, on the other side, you have Cecile Richards, which is going to be important in our second hour as we talk about some of these issues as well. And then, of course, what happens next? I think most people recognize that even if it does reach the 60-vote limit and there is a vote on it, which may not happen, then it would indeed be passed by the House of Representatives, but it's almost likely, virtually certain, that the president would veto it. But then we'd at least have on record where people stand on whether or not your tax dollars should go to fund Planned Parenthood. So there are all sorts of issues that we can talk about. And in the second hour, we're going to spend just a little bit of time first talking about the really poor coverage of this, because what we found through the research done by the Media Research Center is that if you look at sort of the so-called mainstream media, kind of the focus of ABC, NBC, CBS, they spent more than 30 minutes on Cecil, the famed African lion that was shot by an American dentist. But over the last 2 weeks, spent only 11 minutes on the Planned Parenthood story. So it was a virtual shutout. And when you look at some of these nights and some of these coverages, they ignored it entirely. So we'll talk about that. And I also want to get into a little bit more of this comparison between Cecil the Lion and Cecile Richards, who is the head of Planned Parenthood. So Cecil and Cecile will be our conversation in the second hour as well. Just before we take a break, let's mention a few things. In the first half hour, we did talk with Dr. Russell Moore and his book entitled Onward, Engaging the Culture Without Losing the Gospel. We have information about him and the book on the website. And we have your take action item, which is to contact your two senators. And that's something, if you haven't done, you should do. And we also have some of the videos, so if you have not seen them, they're available there at the website pointofview.net. In the second hour, we'll be talking with Katie Yoder with the Media Research Center. We'll look at how this was covered, what actually took place, and then, of course, we'll take some more of your phone calls if you have some comments. If not, I'm going to move on to some other issues because there are quite a few things we can talk about today here on Point of View, but certainly we wanted to do a little bit of coverage on a story which, frankly, has not been covered well by the mainstream media. So let's take a break. You can visit the website, pointofview.net, and join us again in just a few minutes, right after these important messages.
There is a big incentive to pay your electric bill. If you don't, you find yourself in the dark. But who pays to make sure you're educated on the key issues of the day, to bring you wisdom for life at work, at home, and in the culture, like you hear from guests here on Point of View? Who makes sure that our electric bill gets paid? You're way ahead of me, aren't you? That's right. You do. The truth is, if every listener this week gave just $5, we could pay our bills for about the next 3 years. Did you hear me? $5, 3 years. Now, perhaps you can give more. How about $50 or $500, maybe even more? But please, don't be the one who fails to send at least $5. Click the Donate Now button at pointofview.net, pointofview.net, or send $5 to Point of View, Box 30, Dallas, Texas 75221. Box 30, Dallas 75221. Whatever amount you chip in, thank you for your gift. Point of View will continue after this.
I just thank God for y'all. I listen to you every day, truly. I wanted to thank y'all for everything you do each day to inform Christian families and our community about the things we can do, and just the way you're so informative. I listen to you daily and love you guys and appreciate you so much.
God bless you, Kerby, for keeping this show so on track and for the decades of wonderful help to this nation that Point of View has been. We're all big fans of your work, and we pray that God will just prosper it.
As a Christian, over the years that I've followed this program, I am constantly challenged to be on guard and to evaluate what's going on. And if for no other reason, to protect the caliber and the truth of your programming, I need to participate and to back your program financially to ensure that the truth stays out there for people to hear, to view, and to be a part of.
This is Point of View Radio.
Hi, this is Kerby Anderson. You know, each day we take on the tough issues and provide a biblical perspective to them. The topics we cover are wide-ranging: apologetics, theology, prophecy, creation and evolution, intelligent design, marriage, family, child-rearing, the millennial generation, trends in society, politics, economics, business, religious liberty, the Constitution, public policy, foreign policy, military policy, tensions in the Middle East, abortion, godly heritage. We talk about anything that affects your faith, your family, or your freedom. So don't go anywhere, because Point of View continues right now.
Across America, live, this is Point of View. And now, Kerby Anderson.
Second hour, as we continue some of the conversation we've had about Planned Parenthood, and we'll continue it for a little bit longer, simply to now focus on the media coverage or lack thereof of the Planned Parenthood videos. And then I want to read a piece about Cecil the Lion versus Cecile Richards. Cecil and Cecile, what a contrast. And you'll see that contrast, as we mentioned on Friday, and we now are going to get into it in more detail, that when you look at ABC, NBC, and CBS, the so-called mainstream media, spent more than 30 minutes on Cecil, the famed African lion shot by the American dentist. But when you look over the last couple of weeks, Planned Parenthood, by those same networks, got all of about 11 minutes. And we're going to get into more of the details of that as we talk with Katie Yoder. She is a staff writer for the Culture and Media Research Center, and she is involved in various aspects of evaluating what is done there by our good friends at the Media Research Center. So, Katie, thank you for joining us here on Point of View.
Sure. Thank you for having me.
Let's, if we can, get into that in a little more detail. 30 minutes in a 2-day period compared to, 11 minutes over like a 2-week period. It seems to me that the networks were fascinated by Cecil the Lion and the killing and the possible prosecution of Dr. Walter Palmer, the American dentist, but they seem to have very little interest in all these undercover videos of Planned Parenthood. What did you find out?
Sure, absolutely. Well, we began by looking at, from the very beginning, the networks have been hesitant to cover this story. It took more than 24 hours before ABC, NBC, and CBS, all three news shows, covered these videos. And then we found out that Cecil the Lion, these news shows covered the Lion more in one day than these abortion videos in 2 weeks. And then, as you said, that's been updated to 30 minutes on the Lion now. And I came out with a piece last Friday saying now the networks have spent 42 minutes on Cecil the Lion and 18 minutes on the Planned Parenthood videos.
Wow, 42 to 18 just gets worse and worse as you go along here.
It really does. And you would think with the more these videos come out, the more the media would cover these, because they show more and more horrific findings and how they're treating these little babies that are torn apart. But instead, it seems like they're covering less. And the biggest discrepancy between the news shows comes from ABC. They've spent only 46 seconds on the Planned Parenthood videos.
Wow.
They've spent 12 minutes and 14 seconds on Cecil. So it really shows you where their priorities are. It's crazy.
Well, in ABC, that's at the same time you got George Stephanopoulos on Good Morning America talking about the dentist, and he's been vilified across the internet and on and on. We're going to spend most of our time on Planned Parenthood, but let me just for a minute talk about the Cecil the Lion story. From a news point of view, it's kind of interesting. I do not deny that it's a story that had all the elements that people might want. That is, did he break the law? Did that dentist break the law? Was the lion, lured out? What about the way in which the lion was killed, and then the media reaction and the worldwide reaction? I don't begrudge the amount of time they spent on it. It's one of those stories that certainly, if you're looking for ratings, makes some sense. So I don't say that they were wrong in covering the Cecil the Lion story, although I'm going to have more to say about that in just a minute. But the real issue is that when you have undercover videos like this, And let's say if it was undercover videos of animal abuse in a slaughterhouse, or if it were undercover videos of showing individuals making profit from something that they weren't only supposed to get reimbursements for in maybe some area of controversy or graft, there would be a tremendous interest, don't you think, on the mainstream media of covering this. Do you think the reason that they have given it so few minutes is simply because so many of the news editors are pro-abortion and such don't see that this has any news value?
Absolutely, yes. I think they're trying to cover this up because these videos show abortion for what it is. It's, you see Planned Parenthood workers probing through baby body parts, and the media don't want to show that. It's crazy. The media are saying there's an outrage over a lion, but the real outrage is, spending more time on one animal dying than countless babies torn apart by a taxpayer-funded organization. And it's almost like they're treating animals as more important than human beings, which is saddening. And I get that it's easier to identify and to get the general public to agree on one line than on abortion, but when these videos are coming out and you see people laughing over the baby parts, it's how can you not tell the public what's going on by this taxpayer-funded organization?
And again, this is something that you might want to put in context, and I might mention that we have posted your article, and then, of course, they can use that to link to some of your other articles. But you point out that when we have had other times in which Planned Parenthood has been in the news. Let's take the decision that was made by the Susan G. Komen Foundation to actually pull its support of Planned Parenthood. You talk about how the networks gave quite a bit of time to that story until they actually decided to change their mind again and continue to fund Planned Parenthood. So it isn't that there is sort of a media blackout of Planned Parenthood. Whenever Planned Parenthood is under some kind of attack or maybe is going to be defunded, all of a sudden the networks seem to race to their defense, don't you think?
Absolutely, yes. I think the media they're kind of working as Planned Parenthood's PR firm in a way. They did devote more than 3 times to the Susan G. Komen controversy than this, and it's so telling. And you can see this in other examples of how the networks have treated abortion. I mean, if you go back to the case of Philadelphia abortionist Dr. Kermit Gosnell, the networks, it took 56 days before all 3 covered that story. And I mean, I was actually at his trial in the courtroom, and there were only about 15 reporters there. It was empty. So the media, the news shows, they aren't interested in revealing the truth about abortion, and they have a long history of doing this. This is another thing to add to their pro-abortion agenda, kind of just hiding what abortion is.
We're going to take a break, and when we come back, we'll continue with Katie Yoder for a few more minutes, and we have posted her article from the Media Research Center, Culture, and it is a piece that I think you would want to have and maybe post on your Facebook page and start some conversation on this issue of media bias. I know that most of our listeners hear a point of view. This is no big surprise, but at the same time, we wanted to cover it. And so when we come back, let me open up the phones again in case you have a question for her before we move on to some other aspects of this, because, again, they have done such a good job there at the Media Research Center of watching and documenting what is actually covered or not covered. And as a result, you can benefit tremendously from the work that they've done over those years. So if you'd like to join the conversation or have a comment about media bias in this regard, 1-800-351-1212. We'll continue our conversation with Katie Yoder and with you right after these messages.
This is Viewpoints with Kerby Anderson.
Ryan Anderson at the Heritage Foundation has been at the forefront of defending traditional marriage. He is one of the co-authors of the book, What is Marriage? And he goes on college campuses and hostile media venues to defend marriage and to question various attempts to legalize and normalize same-sex marriage. His new book, Truth Overruled, The Future of Marriage and Religious Freedom, deals with the subject from a number of different angles and provides practical help for people willing to engage the discussion. One of his chief concerns is how opponents will portray those of us who believe in traditional marriage. He begins with a question: bigots or pro-lifers? Will defenders be treated like bigots, or will the marriage debate parallel the abortion debate? He believes the outcome will depend on us by taking a lesson from what happened after the Supreme Court decision on abortion. He says the pro-life community woke up and responded to a bad court ruling. They focused on the flaws in the ruling and were able to make the case that the freedom of pro-life people should not be infringed by forcing them to pay for abortion. Now we need to do three things: label the same-sex marriage ruling for what it is, judicial activism. Second, protect our freedom to speak and live according to the truth. And third, make a convincing case in the public arena. In his book, Ryan Anderson talks about the truth about marriage and the consequences of redefining marriage. He cites each of the justices in the Supreme Court case showing that this ruling is indeed judicial tyranny. And he has whole chapters dealing with the victims, both children and homosexual unions, as well as people who decided not to bake a cake for a same-sex wedding. If you want to know how to respond to this new normal and learn how to make the case for marriage and religious freedom, this is a book you need to read. I'm Kerby Anderson, and that's my point of view.
For more information about issues covered on Viewpoints, visit pointofview.net. Pointofview.net.
You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
If you'd like to join our conversation, 1-800-351-1212. We've kept Katie Yoder with us just a little bit longer. She's staff writer for Culture at the Media Research Center. We have her article, Nets spend 30 minutes on Lion censor abortion videos. Now, of course, the latest one, the numbers are even higher. 48 to 16, and before it was 30 minutes to 11. But either way, I mean, you can see that there is very little interest. It is amazing how there are certain topics that there is almost no journalistic curiosity at all. And a lot of that goes back to the research that was done years ago. I remember when I was at Georgetown University in graduate school, Robert Lichter at George Washington University surveyed people in the media elite. And this is part of the media elite that we're talking about here. And he found that more than 90% of them would be described as pro-choice, pro-abortion, whatever phrase you want to use. And so you can see that if somebody says, hey, you know, we ought to cover these videos, one of the news editors say, no, that's not something we're going to cover. Or maybe some of them are saying, well, maybe we have to at least acknowledge it's out there. Or, yeah, we'll cover it, but we'll use this to focus on how this particular group actually was taking these videos illegally, and maybe we need to investigate the Center for Medical Progress, or maybe even we need to do this to defend Planned Parenthood. So lots of issues on the table. But Katie, just before I take another phone call, you said you were at the trial for the Philadelphia abortionist, Kermit Gosnell. This is just gruesome stuff, and you would think of nothing else because of what happened in his clinic and because of his prosecution. there would be an interest in surveying what might be happening in other abortion clinics and whether any of those are prosecutable. And it seems to me that that lack of journalistic curiosity tells me a great deal about the lack of interest of the mainstream media in fairly or even trying to cover the abortion issue at all.
Right, and I would say it's not even so much a lack of interest as they're supporters of abortion and they just don't want to show abortion in a negative light. So they're fine with knowing what's going on, but they're not okay with like looking into the details and showing that to the public and showing them that these babies that are aborted, they have human parts and pieces and they're, you know, they're worth enough to put into research. It's almost like these babies are more human once they're aborted, because then you can see that they have little hands, whereas before they're aborted, Planned Parenthood calls them blobs of tissue.
Yes, and when we were talking with Russell Moore in the first hour, he talked about how they call them products of conception, but even conception says, well, yeah, but that's a human being. But yeah, when you see the babies, and I've seen sometimes that on college campuses, they won't allow life individuals even hold up a banner or a picture of an aborted baby because they say, well, that's too gross. Now, this comes on a campus where they probably are watching slasher films or horror films or things like that. But can you stay around? We wanted to see if we can answer some of these people's questions. Can we do that?
Absolutely, sure.
Let's go to Georgia first. Greg, what would you like to put on the table here?
Just want to know, why is somebody stopping the judge from letting more videos come out about the abortion clinics? How can they do that?
Well, they probably are not going to get away with it for very long, and again, I'll let you step in too, Katie, if you want to, but in the state of California, it's one of these states where you have to, if you're recording something, both individuals need to know that you're recording it. And so some of the recording that was done by the Center for Medical Progress, where the people that were being interviewed realized they were being interviewed, they can still go forward with those. But and the only reason this law exists is because they wanted to protect individuals who might be criminally prosecuted. But in many states, and I happen to be broadcasting today from a state where if at least one person knows that you're recording it, that is the undercover video person, then that is sufficient. So what they've done is reached into something that actually sort of protects criminals, which I still think is a really bad law, and applied it to something that had nothing to do with criminal action. And I suspect that this temporary injunction by this individual who has been a supporter of President Obama probably will not stand, but for the moment it's kind of stopped the dropping of some of the videos, although I do believe that the Center for Medical Progress may have some other interviews they did where they weren't using undercover videos, so we'll see how that plays out over the next couple of weeks here. But that's why it's a bad ruling, and I think it won't stand, but that's where we find ourselves, at least at the moment.
Well, that's my thoughts on it also. It's a bad ruling.
Yeah. Katie, any comments?
Right. Well, obviously they're still bringing out videos despite this, and
because some of them were in Colorado and other places, so it doesn't matter. Yeah, go ahead.
Right. So it's not going to stop everything. And David Daleiden from Center for Medical Progress, he's talking about what's in those videos, even though he can't show them. He's saying that they're showing. He told CNN that they're showing that these fetuses are intact. Some of them are completely intact, and that's why STEM Express doesn't want any evidence. They don't want that revealed that they have intact.
Right, because some of that might actually end up in a criminal trial because it could be that they've engaged in late-term abortions, partial birth abortions, all sorts of other things. Again, there would be such journalistic curiosity if this was happening in a veterinary clinic right now, don't you think? That they were turning baby puppies around and aborting them and then taking their parts and using those for medical research, if they were having some born alive, and then because those are what, when they in these videos, when they talk about born intact, they basically, that's their euphemism for being born alive. So these are, again, stories that I think the mainstream press would want to cover, except for one thing. It has to do with abortion, and they actually, in many cases, support groups like Planned Parenthood. Let's take another phone call real quickly before we let Katie go. Robert, what would you like to put on the table today?
Well, thank you for having me. I'm calling from Georgia, too. My question is, you stated earlier that 80% of Planned Parenthood's clinics are in minority neighborhoods and minority regions within the United States. And it stands to reason that since the majority of their clinics are in minority neighborhoods, that the majority of the fetal parts that are being sold are children born to or who should have been born to ethnic minorities. So I was wondering, is there any scientific reason why ethnic minority children parts would be more valuable? And what I want to know is why aren't groups that seek to, advance the rights and treatment of ethnic minorities in the United States up in arms about their children being targeted more than, Caucasian or privileged children?
Sure. And first of all, that 80% figure was one I just quoted from Sarah Palin, but I've heard it before, so I think it's probably a valid one. And I think it goes back to the founder, Margaret Sanger. And Katie, I let you'll join in here as well. But Margaret Sanger, who has actually been praised recently by one of the presidential candidates, Hillary Clinton, really had a desire to remove people that she felt were unfit. I mean, this really had kind of a survival of the fittest eugenics kind of mindset that was really part and parcel of Planned Parenthood, which actually had a different name. And so part of that, I think, is a fulfillment of some of the designs and plans of the original founder. But then again, I think coming to the second point, we have indeed had individuals on this program who are African American, Hispanic American, that have lamented that there's almost a genocide taking place, especially in the black community, as we have talked about before. The percentage of abortions compared to the percentage of Americans who are black is just completely skewed, and you are seeing actually for the first time a slight decrease in the percentage of African Americans compared to the United States population. A lot of that is due to the disproportionate abortion rates in those communities. So again, you would hope that some of the black leaders would speak up, but there are few and far between. Let's give Alvito King and some others credit, but other than that, you're never going to hear Jesse Jackson or others talk about Planned Parenthood in that way. And that's, I guess, one more illustration, Katie, isn't it, of how the mainstream press doesn't cover some of those very important issues, right?
Right. Oh, they love to hide how abortion targets certain minorities, and Planned Parenthood places its clinics very conveniently to where ethnic minorities live, and also near college campuses. It's scary, but I mean, if people knew, and I think if the media projected this out more, people would be more outraged. But just the media aren't willing to share that kind of information and put that out there for the public to hear.
Well, again, we have posted your article. People can go to mrc.org and find it, but we've also posted your article there. We'll post some of the newer ones as well. And Katie, I appreciate you writing on this. I appreciate the fact that you covered the Kermit Gosnell trial, and I appreciate you giving us some time today here on Point of View.
Sure. Thank you for having me.
We are going to take a break. When we come back, I want to talk a little bit about Cecil and Cecile, Cecil the Lion and Cecile Richards of Planned Parenthood. What a contrast. We already talked about this from a media point of view. Let's talk about it from a moral or ethical point of view. And if you'd like to join us this last half hour, we've got a lot more to cover. 1-800-351-1212. We also have some take action items and some great material for you to read on the website pointofview.net. We'll be back with more right after this.
If you've been a Christian for any length of time, no doubt you've heard about Jesus feeding thousands with a few loaves of bread and a couple of fish. Jesus took something small and turned it into something big. Recently, someone here at Point of View made an interesting discovery. He did some math and figured out that according to the number of faithful listeners we have, if you and every other listener gave $5, it would help Kerby and the team bring you interviews and commentary for not 3 months, but 3 years. You heard me right. If every listener donates just $5, we'd pay what it costs to bring you this needed information for 3 years. And if you urge a friend to join you, you send 5, they send 5, well, you can imagine the impact. Click the Donate Now button at pointofview.net. Pointofview.net, or send $5 to Point of View, Box 30, Dallas, Texas 75221. Box 30, Dallas 75221. Send $5. Urge a friend to join you. Support Point of View. Point of View will continue after this.
You are listening to Point of View. The opinions expressed on Point of View do not necessarily reflect the views of the management or staff of this station. And now, here again is Kerby Anderson.
Final half hour, if you'd like to join our conversation, 1-800-351-1212. Been talking about the abortion videos. We'll get on to a few other issues in just a minute, but I thought we'd finish off by looking at that contrast. When we had Katie Yoder with us, we talked about the difference between the coverage of Cecil the Lion and the coverage of these abortion videos of Planned Parenthood. There's a very good piece by Kevin Williamson. You can read it in its entirety in National Review, but he calls Cecil and Cecile humanist, but not for the human. And he says that Cecil the Lion gave the left a great gift. The death of the African apex predator at the hands of Dr. Walter Palmer, an American dentist, has driven the North American apex predator, Cecile Richards of Planned Parenthood, off the front page for the moment. Not all harvesting is equal in the eyes of the American chattering class. The point he's making is that this gave everybody a respite from even having to cover the Planned Parenthood videos, which had been dropping pretty much regularly once a week over the last month. He goes on to say that Palmer, that is the dentist, is, if the press accounts of his activities are accurate, an incompetent and unethical hunter, not really a hunter at all, but a poacher. Hunting predators over bait is not sporting in many places. Crossbow hunting is disallowed or restricted to persons with disabilities that prevent them from operating ordinary archery equipment. Luring park animals partly accustomed to human interaction in hunting areas is despicable, and Palmer had previously pleaded guilty to charges relating to the poaching of a black bear. As a lion hunter, Palmer's ethical violations were compounded by his incompetence. His first shot wounded the lion but failed to kill him. At this point, it was incumbent upon him to immediately pursue the lion and kill him. Palmer took 2 days to do so. Of course, stalking a wounded lion in the bush is a dicey proposition. That's why they call it a dangerous game. He went on to say that hunting African game is an unpredictable business. Cape buffalo hunters have been put down a dozen of beasts with one shot. Each occasionally will encounter a specimen that survives the first shot, the second, the third. There are cases in which a dozen properly placed shots failed to fell the animal. But those hunters, if they are competent and ethical, pursue the quarry until down. And Cape buffalo, despite their herbivorous habits, are generally held to be considerably more dangerous than lions. On the subject of Cape buffalo, the famous African hunter Robert Rourke offered one of my all-time favorite observations. He says, you can point a rifle at a Cape buffalo and he looks at you like you owe him money. Anybody with sufficiently deep pockets can go to hunt, but that doesn't make them a hunter. He says there isn't probably a U.S. law under which to charge Dr. Palmer. The African lion is not listed on an endangered species, though perhaps it should be. But the federal code is vast and the Justice Department is creative, and perhaps Cecil's civil rights were violated, and there is talk of extraditing Palmer to Zimbabwe. But there isn't really a Zimbabwe law under which to charge him either, inasmuch as there is no problem probably understood in Zimbabwe, only the whimsy of dictator Robert Mugabe, who has been running Zimbabwe since I was carrying a Star Wars lunchbox to the 2nd grade. But of course, we are not going to be talking about that. American public discourse is a mile wide and an inch deep, and it operates almost exclusively in generalities. The broader, the better. For the moment, the conversation, such as it is dominated by the cry, lions nice, hunters bad. We might take this moment to remind ourselves that Zimbabwe is a psychotic state with failed institutions, and the Mugabe style is unhappily not restricted to Mugabe or to Zimbabwe. We might consider that there are ethical and unethical modes of big game hunting, and we might, if we're so inclined, meditate on the fact that hunters have for generations played a critical role in the conservation of wildlife and habitat. If we are feeling philosophical, we might even think for a moment about the fact that those who would ban hunting out of an awe for nature and the natural order, in fact, pervert that order by denying man's abilities and unique role in it, and wonder whether man who has killed his own breakfast, even if it's only a perch, can really understand that. Well, anyway, the point he makes is, and I will go on to say that here for a while, Cecil the Lion not only gave the press something to talk about, and certainly, I'm sure, helped their ratings, but it also gave those who might have been inclined to support Planned Parenthood a chance to take a break from what they might have been forced to cover if there had not been the Cecil the Lion. And, of course, Cecile Richards, the head of Planned Parenthood, went on one of the talking head shows, but then as more and more of these videos began to drop, began to be even more difficult for even Planned Parenthood or its defenders to try to see its way clear to defending what was taking place. And that brings us, of course, to the vote today in the United States Senate, which again will be a bit of a show vote, but it's still worthwhile to simply see where indeed various members of Congress stand on this very important issue. And I've noticed in the House of Representatives, which I'm sure would actually pass a measure to defund Planned Parenthood, there are some that have simply said, we feel so strongly about this issue that we will not pass an appropriations bill that has funding for Planned Parenthood. So this could cause a real difficulty for maybe John Boehner and some others. So we'll see where that plays out. But just for a few minutes before we move on to the next topic, I thought I'd give you a little bit of a sense of history. The other problem I have with the mainstream media is, first of all, as we just pointed out with the piece by Katie Yoder, they don't cover the stories. They ignore certain very important stories. But the other big complaint that I have, and this is true of a lot of media, is they never give you the context. And I thought I would for just a minute, because long before we had some of these videos from the Center for Medical Progress, we had all the videos by Lila Rose, who's been on this program, and her organization Live Action. She did, for example, a 6-year investigation of Planned Parenthood and their covering up of such things as statutory rape and sexual trafficking. She and others posed in undercover abortion clinics to expose some of the sexual crimes, and she actually believes that this is rampant through the abortion industry. Let me just give you a couple of examples, and I think you can see what we're dealing with. For example, in New Jersey, a Planned Parenthood director was caught on camera, seen encouraging an undercover actor who was posing as a pimp, dressed in an outlandish outfit, by the way, as well, to get abortions for his illegal immigrant and underage prostitutes. No problem there. Another video, you had a teenage girl actually posing as a 13-year-old, told a Planned Parenthood worker that she was having sex with a 31-year-old man. If you aren't aware of that, it's called statutory rape. So basically, on the video, you have the worker saying, I don't want to know the age. You have another Planned Parenthood nurse in Indiana told these undercover actors that these actors should lie about the age of their abuser. Say whenever you see him, he's 14 or he's in your grade or whatever. And so they were telling these individuals who were actually having sex supposedly with people over their age, over the age of consent, and they were under the age of consent, to lie about the age of the individual that, quote, got them pregnant. Then you have another set of videos that came out that found a racist connection in the Office of Planned Parenthood. One undercover investigator, for example, before they even did the videos, simply just started calling Planned Parenthood offices. They called them in Idaho, in New Mexico, and Oklahoma, Ohio, a lot of places where we broadcast. And he posed as a potential donor to Planned Parenthood and wanted to know if the entire amount of his donation could be used to specifically abort black babies. Well, of course, nobody had any difficulty with that. Matter of fact, despite some very racial and racist kind of comments on the phone, no Planned Parenthood employee, either a director or anyone else, could really actually have any problems. And as a matter of fact, none of them were willing to refuse his donation that was targeted to, quote, reduce the number of blacks. Kind of gets back to our conversation we had just a minute ago with Robert. And just on the first day of calling these clinics, not a single Planned Parenthood representative expressed outrage or concern at some of the anti-black kind of comments, the racist kind of comments. Some even went so far as agreeing with some of the racist comments. And so you can again see that indeed you have this kind of problem. And the number that I've been able to dig up is that about 79% of the Planned Parenthood clinics are located near minority neighborhoods. And of course, I quoted just a minute ago Sarah Palin using the 80% figure, so that's quite in there. And the 79% figure comes from a group called Protecting Black Life. So those all precede then the interviews that were done with, for example, Dr. Deborah Nucatola, where she talks about we're only going to crush this part, not crush that part. And then, of course, we have some of the others where they were talking about using different parts and wanting to get a Lamborghini. And so there are all sorts of issues that have preceded that. And I guess just before we take a break, the biggest question I want to put on the table is a very simple one. And that is, if all of the abuses that we've seen, turning a blind eye to statutory rape, turning a blind eye to the racist comments, and now turning a blind eye to even the harvesting of tissue, do not defund Planned Parenthood, what is it going to take? We'll be right back.
Now, back to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Time for a few more minutes, and I want to spend just a moment talking about the upcoming presidential debate for the Republicans this week, but also the Democratic race has gotten a lot more interesting. And up until now, we've primarily been talking about Hillary Clinton. Would that be a coronation? I love some of the interviews and stories coming out right now. John Fund has a good piece, and he says Hillary's two races: to keep ahead of the investigators and to win the White House. Because some of the things coming down against Hillary Clinton right now are maybe suggesting that she may not necessarily be the Democratic nominee. Of course, we've for some time heard people like Donald Trump saying, I don't think I'm going to be running against Hillary Clinton. I think I'm going to be running against Joe Biden. Of course, whether he's running and whether he's right are, of course, two big issues. But let's put this on the table. You have Hillary Clinton, of course, running. You have Bernie Sanders, who's done relatively well. And I think I need to add another name because it's pretty obvious now that Joe Biden is going to run. And that would not have been the case if it hadn't been for all the problems surrounding Hillary Clinton. When his son died, Beau Biden died, he said, "Dad, I want you to run." And I think he's thinking seriously about running. And for some months now, because I'm in the news business, I get a lot of emails that you don't. Be grateful that you don't. But one of those has been the draft Biden emails that I've been getting, and I think they're getting a lot more serious about that. So those are three. Well, let me add a fourth. Who would have guessed Starbucks' Howard Schultz is very serious about running as well. He's the chairman and CEO of Starbucks, 62 years of age, has actually been very interested in some of the political issues, as you might know. He wrote the book last year, co-wrote the book, For Love of Country, What Our Veterans Can Teach Us About Citizenship, Heroism, and Sacrifice. Now, on the marriage issue, we probably don't agree with him, but it is interesting on a lot of other issues. There may be some agreement. I mean, he would obviously run on the Democratic side, but on some issues, he would not be necessarily holding to the Democratic line. And I think part of it is he's looking around and saying, well, if Donald Trump can run, why can't I run? And so we will see whether or not Howard Schultz, chairman and CEO of Starbucks, runs for the Democratic nomination. And if he did, he would have a lot of money to bring to the table, just as Donald Trump does, has a lot of visibility. And so we'll have to see. It's kind of intriguing. He once owned the Seattle Supersonics. Of course, they are now in Oklahoma. And he, is again dealing with a budget, his own personal budget, plus all his friends might be able to fund a campaign. So we'll see how that plays out. So it's gotten real interesting on the Democratic side, and it's quite frankly confusing on the Republican side. First of all, the Fox News debate says that they will only carry 10. Now, I believe that if you have a tie on the 10th, they would bring in an 11th, and that might be good news for Rick Perry, because right now, if I look at the numbers, it looks like number 9 is Kasich, number 10 is Christie, and so he would be left out. And that means that the other, and they used to say 6, but now we have Gilmore, 7 candidates would then be in the what are called the happy hour debate, which is going to be at 4 or 5 in the afternoon. And that would be Rick Perry, Bobby Jindal, Rick Santorum, Carly Fiorina, George Pataki, Lindsey Graham, and then, of course, Jim Gilmore. But that means in the top 10, I think you would have to say that it really kind of divides out in this way. You have the top 3 and then the bottom 7. The top 3, of course, would be Donald Trump and Jeb Bush and Scott Walker, all of whom have at least 12% in the case of Bush, in case of Trump, 21%. And so there are kind of the top 3 that kind of sit together. Then you have a break, and then you go to Ben Carson at 6%, Huckabee at 6%, Mike Huckabee at 6%, Ted Cruz at 6%, Marco Rubio almost at 6%, 5.8%, Rand Paul at 5.6%. Then the drop off to both the ones that we talked about just a minute ago in terms of John Kasich and Chris Christie at about 3%. So that's kind of how it plays itself out. But there will be some interesting negotiations going on perhaps behind the scene, because if Rick Perry's numbers go up a little bit higher, even if Chris Christie's go down or Kasich's go down or something like that, they might bring in an 11th. But the biggest problem, of course, is how you can come away with any kind of continuity, given the fact that if 10 people are on this debate stage, most of them only get a few minutes to say much of anything. And so it will be interesting to see how well that is. But there is something to be talked about, and that is simply the Donald Trump factor. If I were to tell you a couple of months ago that there is a debate that is going to take place, the first presidential debate will take place August 6th, and I were to ask you, how many people do you think will be watching it? You would probably say, probably a handful of individuals that actually are interested in these kind of political developments. But by and large, most of us would probably wait till it was narrowed down a little bit. And yet here we have a situation in which it probably will be watched by a number of individuals. How many will watch the one in the afternoon compared to the one in the evening, I don't know. But it may be one of those debates where people are going to watch it, if for no other reason, just to see what Donald Trump has to say. And whether or not he stays in the race or not, he's created a little bit of energy and a little bit of audience enthusiasm that might not have been there before. So we'll see how it plays out. But again, Donald Trump and Jeb Bush and Scott Walker, kind of the three in the top tier. And then Ben Carson, Mike Huckabee, Ted Cruz, Marco Rubio, Rand Paul, John Kasich, and Chris Christie a little bit further down. And so we'll see how that plays out. So again, we will encourage you to spend some time watching it, and we'll spend a little bit of time on Friday talking about what was said, who said it, and we'll see if we can pull out one or two sound bites that might be of interest to you. Just before I say goodbye, let me mention that my commentary today is on this new book by Ryan Anderson, and he was on the program with us last week, and sometimes I try to write a commentary based upon an interview because I think it was really helpful, and of course his new book is entitled Overruled: The Future of Marriage and Religious Freedom. And I really think that he has done a very good job of helping us understand that as we see the attacks on religious liberty, sometimes even the attacks on Christianity, we maybe can take a very good lesson from what we talked about earlier, even when we had Rachel call in, and that is the pro-life movement has done a great deal of work to make sure that we didn't get marginalized. If anything, there are probably more people that call themselves pro-life now than before. And a lot of that had to do with, first of all, making it very clear that the decision of Roe versus Wade was actually an example of judicial tyranny, and it was a wrongful decision. I think we need to do the same thing with the decision that came down on same-sex marriage, and then really making the case that pro-life people should not have their tax dollars go to something that they morally do not support. And that gets us back to the debate we've had here with Planned Parenthood. And likewise, we can make the same kind of case that even if we may disagree with the individuals that support same-sex marriage, we should not be penalized by that. And so, again, there are some very important principles that he has in the book. And if you haven't had a chance to read my commentary, please take the time to do so. It's part of the Viewpoints commentary, and we encourage you, number one, to take a chance of looking at it, to read it. Then you can actually click on the button that says See More Viewpoints. And then, of course, we'll also make it available for those of you that would want to hear it or send it on to others. So a lot of radio stations carry that commentary. The Viewpoints commentary is available every single day of the work week. And, of course, we also play it during the break. In the first break, both the first and second hour. So lots of resources available at the website, pointofview.net. So I hope that you'll take the time to check those out. That's all we have for today. I want to thank Andrew and Catherine and Chris and Abby for the help behind the scenes. Tomorrow we're going to have a chance to get into some very important issues, especially in the second hour with Oz Guinness. So I hope you'll join us then.
There is a big incentive to pay your electric bill. If you don't, you find yourself cold and in the dark. But who pays to make sure you're educated on the key issues of the day, to bring you wisdom for life at work, at home, and in the culture, like you hear from guests here on Point of View? Who makes sure that our electric bill gets paid? You're way ahead of me, aren't you? That's right. You do. The truth is, if every listener this week gave just $5, we could pay our bills for about the next 3 years. Did you hear me? $5, 3 years. Now, perhaps you can give more. How about $50 or $500, maybe even more? But please, don't be the one who fails to send at least $5. Click the Donate Now button at pointofview.net, pointofview.net, or send $5 to Point of View, Box 30, Dallas, Texas 75221. Box 30, Dallas 75221. Whatever amount you chip in, thank you for your gift. Point of View is produced by Point of View Ministries.